What happens if vampires lived among humans? The arrival, no one remembers the exact moment it began. There were rumors, whispers in the streets, unexplained disappearances that went unnoticed at first. A child who didn't return home. A factory worker found a pale and lifeless person behind a locked door. At first, the deaths were rare, scattered, and could be explained away, accidents, crime, or disease, but patterns emerged. Hospitals recorded a sudden increase in cases of anemia, blood loss, and severe trauma with no signs of struggle. Law enforcement files began to show a common thread: victims drained of blood, yet no bite marks in some cases, and always during the night. At first, people denied it. Vampires don't exist, they said, but denial cannot stop evidence. Photos emerged, blurry and grainy, of pale figures with glowing eyes moving through city streets at night. CCTV footage caught movement patterns that no human could replicate: speed, agility, reflexes beyond normal capacity. Witnesses described figures disappearing into shadows, only to reappear blocks away in seconds. By the second month, it became clear something was among us. Something predatory, intelligent, and untraceable. The biology of the predator scientists struggled to classify these beings. They were humanoid in shape, but their physiology defied explanation. Their skin was unnaturally pale, almost reflective under moonlight, lacking the warmth of human blood circulation. Their eyes dilated to absorb minimal light, allowing perfect night vision. Their muscles contained denser fibers, making their strength far beyond any known human. Their survival depended entirely on blood. Not all blood humans were preferred, but they were not picky. The chemical analysis of victims' remains showed rapid depletion of red blood cells, yet coagulation seemed delayed, suggesting an enzyme in the vampire saliva that prevented clotting. The damage to the human body was both fast and methodical. Blood, it seemed, was not just sustenance but a form of energy fueling metabolism, strength, and possibly longevity. Those attacked often appeared lifeless within minutes, even if small amounts of blood were taken. Recovery for survivors was slow and painful, often leaving permanent psychological scars. Society under threat. As sightings became more frequent, panic spread. News outlets attempted to report the events, but the victims and the predators were invisible during daylight. Vampires moved at night, striking with precision, avoiding exposure. Cities adopted curfews, but even strict measures could not contain them. By the third month, governments began to classify the vampire phenomenon as a national emergency. Surveillance systems were intensified. Military patrols were deployed at night, equipped with weapons designed to exploit the vampire physiology: UV lamps, high-intensity lights, silver-coated projectiles, and specialized blades. Yet despite these efforts, vampires adapted. They learned human behavior, avoided traps, and even infiltrated urban systems. Entire neighborhoods became no-go zones after dark. Some human survivors formed militias, scavenging supplies and defending territories, but casualties were high. Psychological toll. Living under the shadow of predators that strike in darkness changed human behavior profoundly. Sleep disorders became widespread. People stopped going out at night, even in daylight, fearing retribution or hunting by vampires who adapted to minimal light. Social isolation increased. Depression and paranoia skyrocketed. Entire cultures shifted to a nocturnal mindset, conducting daily business in brief daylight hours and hiding after sunset. Children who grew up in this era remembered the dark as a living thing, a predator itself, rather than an absence of light. Many developed severe anxiety and phobias. Adults carried the weight of fear into every decision. Humanity had never faced an opponent that was both unseen and nearly invincible, and the psychological strain was as deadly as any physical attack. Vampire society evidence suggested that vampires were not mindless predators. Some were solitary hunters, but others appeared to organize into small packs or covens, showing territorial behavior and strategic hunting. Intelligence was evident in patterns, targeting humans in groups, using deception, ambush, and intimidation. Occasionally, humans were left alive but marked with a warning. Researchers began to speculate that vampires had an internal social hierarchy. Observers reported encounters with particularly large or dominant figures that appeared to command others. Communication was subtle gestures, glances, or a change in pace but coordinated. Their society, if it could be called that, functioned in parallel with humanity's, overlapping only when hunting. The first mass disappearance, the tipping point, came in the 6th month. A city in Eastern Europe, population 300,000, reported nearly 1,500 missing persons within a single week. Bodies were found in abandoned warehouses, drained of blood, often without an obvious cause of death. Hospitals struggled to cope. Families barricaded themselves in homes. Roads were empty. Law enforcement lost control. For the first time, scientists and government officials considered a radical conclusion. Vampires were not a disease or supernatural myth. They were an invasive predator that had entered the human population and was capable of organizing and thriving in secrecy. Mass hysteria ensued. Social media exploded with rumors, survival guides, and videos of alleged sightings. Human communities started developing curfews, fortified zones, and independent militias. Cities became ghost towns by night. Humanity had to adapt to survive, but adaptation came with a cost: freedom. The human response: over the next year, humans began creating fortified settlements. Nighttime became forbidden outside, with only essential personnel venturing out in protective gear and weapons. Families lived in underground shelters or high-rise apartments with reinforced windows and UV defenses. Humans who had been infected or bitten developed strange immunity or resistance, leading to rumors of half-vampires, humans who survived attacks but carried residual abilities or instincts. Scientific teams attempted to develop chemical deterrents, ultraviolet weaponry, and even genetic research, hoping to understand or neutralize vampires. Progress was slow. Vampires adapted faster. Humanity learned that direct confrontation led to heavy casualties. Stealth and avoidance became the dominant survival strategy. The moral dilemma. As humans struggled to survive, ethical questions emerged. Could vampires be reasoned with? Were they sentient enough to negotiate? Or were they merely predators with intelligence? Stories emerged of vampires who spared humans, sometimes even providing sustenance from animals instead of people. But these cases were rare, anecdotal, and often met with suspicion. Meanwhile, humans began to question their own morality. The fight to survive blurred lines. Killing vampires became normalized. Torture, traps, and human experimentation were justified in the name of survival. Entire governments sanctioned hunts, using humans as bait. Humanity became both victim and perpetrator in a world that had shifted its rules. The new normal decades passed. Humanity never regained full control, but life adapted. Children were born into darkness. Schools and workplaces shifted schedules. Daylight hours became sacred, a brief reprieve in a world that otherwise belonged to predators. Urban design changed. Fortified walls, UV lighting, and underground tunnels became standard infrastructure. Vampires became part of the urban ecosystem. Sightings, once rare, were now routine. Humans learned to predict their movements, understand their patterns, and coexist cautiously. Fear remained, but so did survival skills. New generations who never knew a world without predators learned to navigate the night as naturally as humans once walked in the sun. The dark realization, perhaps the most chilling aspect, was the truth humanity slowly accepted. The world had changed permanently. Vampires were not going away. Humanity was not dominant. Survival meant adaptation, compromise, and constant vigilance. The sun, once a guarantee, was now irrelevant to life after dark. The age of innocence was gone. Children now learned to fear not only the dark, but what moved within it. Society had transformed, stronger in some ways, fragile in others. Cooperation, strategy, and caution replaced freedom, exploration, and leisure. Humanity had survived, but at a cost. The question lingered: could humans ever reclaim dominance, or would the planet forever belong to predators that thrived in shadow? And in the stillness of the night, when cities slept behind reinforced walls, when hunters and hunted paused for a moment of uneasy peace, one truth became undeniable: the world had changed. Humans were no longer at the top of the food chain. They were just another species trying to survive among predators. The shadows within. By the second decade, humanity had adapted to a nocturnal existence. Cities were no longer vibrant hubs of culture, they had become fortified fortresses. Streets were empty after sunset, and the few who ventured out wore protective clothing, UV lamps strapped to arms and sensors that tracked movement within 100 meters. The night belonged to the predators. Vampires, meanwhile, had grown bolder. They learned human patterns, observed schedules, and struck when defenses were weakest. Reports of attacks became less random and more strategic. Entire neighborhoods would lose multiple residents in a single night. Human militias retaliated, but casualties were staggering. Every confrontation confirmed a terrifying fact. Vampires were not only predators, they were highly intelligent, capable of coordinated hunting and rapid adaptation. One of the darkest consequences of coexistence was psychological. Humans lived in perpetual fear, and generations grew up never seeing sunlight. Children were pale, timid, and hyper-aware of every shadow. They learned from infancy that silence was survival. Social interactions were limited to underground chambers, reinforcing isolation and paranoia. Anxiety became endemic. Depression rampant. Meanwhile, vampires developed their own forms of social organization. Some established territories, marked by symbols carved into walls or buildings. Others formed covens with strict hierarchies, using subordinates to hunt while the elders observed from hidden lairs. Intelligence was their greatest weapon. Patience allowed them to exploit human weaknesses, infiltrate settlements, and manipulate fear. Medical research uncovered horrifying truths. Humans attacked by vampires sometimes survived but carried permanent physiological and psychological changes. A bite could leave survivors with heightened reflexes, partial sensitivity to light, and an inexplicable craving for blood. While not vampires themselves, these survivors became unpredictable, sometimes turning against their own communities under stress. By the 25th year, the world had bifurcated. Humans who clung to the light of civilization, fortified underground, and the vampires who ruled the darkness above. Between them, a fragile tension persisted. Neither side could dominate completely, but neither could coexist peacefully. Every night was a gamble. The new hunger. As decades passed, humans became increasingly aggressive in defending what remained of their world. Militias developed UV artillery, drones, and remotely operated vehicles equipped with flamethrowers and high-intensity floodlights. Their underground cities were connected by tunnels, allowing movement without exposure to the night. Humans grew stronger, faster, and more resourceful, but every technological advancement was met with vampire adaptation. Vampires evolved alongside humans. They developed resistance to UV radiation, faster regenerative abilities, and even methods of coordinated ambush using urban infrastructure. Some researchers hypothesized that vampires could metabolically manipulate their bodies, slowing hunger cycles for days or weeks to conserve energy, a critical adaptation when humans fortified neighborhoods. Society fractured further. The fear of predation became the defining principle of human life. Entire cities were abandoned above ground, leaving urban wastelands to vampires. Communication networks operated only during daylight hours when vampires were inactive, creating an eerie rhythm: daytime for human survival, nighttime for predator dominance. This era also gave rise to hybrid fears. Human survivors who had endured vampire attacks exhibited strange behaviors: heightened aggression, nocturnal habits, and sometimes a craving for blood. Communities began suspecting these survivors of collusion with vampires, creating paranoia within fortified settlements. Trust, once a social cornerstone, became nearly extinct. Cultural shifts reflected the new order. Myths and legends were revived, blending superstition with reality. Vampires were no longer fantasy. They were acknowledged predators, but humans told stories of cunning vampires who negotiated, deceived, or even spared lives. Some humans worshipped them out of fear, leaving blood offerings to keep certain vampires away. Others built secret networks to hunt and eliminate vampires systematically. Humanity's last stand by the 50th year, the balance between humans and vampires had become stable but deadly. Entire continents were effectively abandoned. Forests and mountain ranges became vampire sanctuaries. Cities that remained inhabited by humans had elaborate UV defenses, motion sensors, and reinforced structures. Technology became a weapon of survival rather than progress. The human population had shrunk dramatically. Only those capable of constant vigilance, resourcefulness, and adaptation survived. Children were trained from infancy in combat, stealth, and emergency protocols. Education emphasized survival strategies, reading predator behavior, and maintaining vigilance during every activity. Even play and recreation were constrained to safe zones. Meanwhile, vampires had expanded their territories, often using psychological warfare. Some would leave messages after attacks, cryptic symbols, painted blood sigils, or piles of drained animals to instill fear. Coordination between vampire covens suggested long-term planning. They were not merely hunters, but strategists capable of influencing human behavior over generations. The greatest horror, however, was the realization that humans had begun to resemble their predators. Violence, paranoia, and predatory instincts became normalized. Communities rationed humans as resources for both survival and training. Ethical boundaries eroded. Killing for safety became institutionalized. Humanity, once compassionate and social, had transformed into a species of survivors conditioned by fear and the night. Some humans attempted diplomacy. A few envoys ventured into vampire territories, offering trade in exchange for safety. These missions rarely succeeded. Vampires tolerated humans only when convenient. Even those who spoke or negotiated were often eliminated quietly if they failed to provide sufficient advantage. As time passed, the planet became a world of division. Above ground, vampires roamed freely, cunning, lethal, and patient. Below ground, humans survived in a fragile network of fortified cities, reliant on technology, discipline, and constant vigilance. Both species coexisted, but neither ruled. The predator-prey dynamic defined every aspect of existence. In the end, the long-term consequences became clear. Humanity had survived, but at the cost of its innocence, freedom, and moral certainty. Life had become a perpetual calculation: avoid the shadows, fortify defenses, train the next generation to endure. Children grew up knowing fear as their natural state. Communities operated like militarized compounds rather than societies. Civilization had not ended, but it had transformed irreversibly. And somewhere in the darkness, vampires watched, waited, and hunted with patience born of centuries. The night was theirs, and humans had learned that to survive was not enough. They had to adapt, outsmart, and endure in a world that no longer belonged to them. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. See you in the next one.